exercise, we will be looking at some organizations that are bypassing institutional pressures to become greener. Here, the conventional wisdom is that organizations need to follow the social pressures, need to comply with them, because otherwise they will get penalties. It will suffer reputational damages, especially. But we know, for anecdotal evidence, I will show you later, that some exceptions abound. And finally, we will ask why these environmental normative deviance, or these why some organizations do not comply, these actors do not comply with social pressures, vary across countries. And here, several perspectives abound, but they focus on individual and organizational factors, and we will be looking at cultural factors. So let's begin with chapter 2, the organizational factor. Here, in this topic, organizations, decarbonization, we have two different streams, or a conversation on two sides. First, we have an inconvenient truth, that is, decarbonization processes fail because of market pressures. That is, when an organization wants to implement a new environmental innovation, the market pressures, the need for business profitability usually puts the firm out of the environmental path, right? They go back to business as usual. Another perspective brings some optimism in this conversation by positing that organizational decisions have some impact. Firms can address environmental challenges by changing the strategies or their operations. This is a recent debate in the management field, but many also, it has a long historic tradition in economics, in law and regulation, and the consensus outside the management field is that first, technological frontiers shape firms' decarbonization, so firms are contingent. Decarbonization is contingent on the technological progress, for instance, in chemical processes or in technologies. And on the other hand, that firms react to institutional changes, while decisions are constrained by culture. So there is a technological part and an institutional/cultural part. There we question if what organizations do matters. Of course, on top of technology and institutions. For this, we obtain data from Thomson Reuters ESG database, and we take the CO2 emissions of organizations, the scope 1 plus scope 2. And to understand how institutional factor, how the industry factor, and how the organizational factor matter, we take a variance decomposition analysis. That is, we will be dividing our sample in 3 different levels: country, industry, and organizational level. We also introduce the country industry because some industries have specificities in some countries. For instance, the IT sector in India, or the automaker industry in Japan. In this table, we have the results. To the left, we have the different country, the different effects. In the middle column, we have the variance component, that is the amount of variance for each level. And to make sense of the results, we should focus on the right column, that is a percentage of the variation to total. That is calculated just by adding all the variance in the sample and dividing each level for this total. First, we see that country, institutional effects, culture, account for around 20% of the total variance in decarbonization. Industry effects account for around 40%, and firm effects account for almost 40%. And the residual is, because this is a panel data, the residual is just the evolution over time. That is between 2005 and 2019. The main takeaways of this exercise. So, country and industry effects matter, but organizational factors do as well. So we need to consider that what firms do, what managers do, is important for the decarbonization of firms. So it's not completely exogenous to the decision of the firm. This changes the question from do they matter to how it is possible that some firms are actually decarbonizing the processes. This exercise doesn't allow us to make, to explore the specific mechanisms that are at stake here, but we can intuitively reason the existence of win-win strategies. Decarbonization initiatives, we know, according to past research, that can enhance material efficiency in lean manufacturing operations, and also that the same initiatives can provide new competitive advantages when they are introduced in strategies of cost leadership and differentiation. Recognizing the existence of this win-win and the importance of managerial practices imply changing how business sustainability is framed, right? We need to start thinking or understanding that managers play a role, and this implies a change of conversation, not only in organizations, a conversation that is possible to decarbonize without cost, but some benefits can accrue to these processes, to these innovations, re-innovations, but also in consulting firms, industry associations. So we need to create a rhetoric that conveys that fighting climate change from within the organization is possible. So let's move now to the industry factor. That, as in the last chapter we've seen, it matters around 40%, so it's an important conditioning of firms' decarbonization and well, generally speaking of environmental performance. Here we begin by considering one of the central tenets in organizational theory, that is that organizations should conform to social norms, because this provides what we call legitimacy. Organizations need legitimacy to obtain resources, because otherwise they cannot obtain resources. If they, put differently, if they lose legitimacy, the organization is ostracized. No one will want to transact with this organization. For instance, we have two headlines that this action does not always hold. Most climate action 100+ companies are failing on emissions. BP criticized our plan to spend billions more on fossil fuels than green energy. So what we are seeing is that despite these social pressures to make processes greener, several organizations and quite big organizations in industries that are key for the transition to a green economy are not complying with social pressures. And we want to understand why. So, we start by thinking or reframing legitimacy evaluations as a social system of control, right? Basically, a legitimacy evaluation is that one stakeholder, individuals, suppliers, customers, start to pay attention to what the firm is doing in terms of environmental behavior, of course. Then, this behavior, this level of compromise, we can say, with environment through the implementation of green initiatives, is benchmarked against what the leader does. And is this benchmarking what conveys information about what the firm is doing? And this is important because legitimacy evaluations are a way of obtaining social information. Social information as opposed to individual information. And these are the two types of information identified in cognitive science. Individual information is the information we obtain through interaction with things, right? If a cup is hot and I touch it, This will convey me some information, individual information. But if one of you touches the cap and I see you that you get burned, I don't need to touch the cap. And this is social information. So this is the dichotomic informational process that takes place in our brain. And both are important for decision making, but their weight changes according to the situation. In those situations where obtaining individual information, individual experience is difficult, we tend to rely to social information. And of course, vice versa. When it's easy to obtain individual information, we tend to obtain information by ourselves. Considering this, legitimacy evaluations should be contingent on the conditions of the environment to the extent that our tendency to focus on social information changes. So we pay attention to three specific conditions of the environment. First, environmental complexity. That is the level of heterogeneity, of dispersion, or variety in the elements outside the boundaries of the firm. So how dispersed are other firms in the industry, basically? This environmental complexity increases the information processing and understanding of the situation in the industry. Because it is difficult to obtain individual information by suppliers, by customers, they start to rely on social information, that is legitimacy evaluations. And because individuals are focusing to a greater extent on the behavior of the firm compared to others, then the more the firm deviates from the industry leader, the higher the penalties. And we call this normative deviance. Normative deviance, the distance between the leader and its firm. Under situations for environmental complexity, this distance will be more negative in terms of the firm performance. Stated as a hypothesis, environmental complexity negatively moderates the impact of normative deviance on performance. The second characteristic is dynamism, or the level of unpredictable change in the environment. Environmental dynamism increases uncertainty, and this increases the difficulties of obtaining information in the industry. The same process, difficulties in obtaining information. This makes legitimacy evaluations more salient. The consequences of normative deviance, of this distance between the firm and the leader, worsens. It's stated as a hypothesis, environmental dynamism negatively moderates the impact of normative deviance on performance. And finally, we have environmental hostility, that is the resource scarcity in the environment of the firm. Environmental hostility increases uncertainty. Why? Because some firms, because of the scarcity of resources, start to behave unexpectedly. For instance, they engage in corruption, they change suddenly of strategies, so individuals cannot guess what the next steps of the firm will be. So this, as I said, increases the uncertainty and the complexity of decision making. Again, this complexity makes this complexity and these things make individuals more bound to rely on social information, the legitimacy evaluations become more salient, and then normative deviance has higher costs. As a hypothesis, environmental hostility negatively moderates the impact of normative deviance on performance. Moving on to the empirics, we retrieve data again from environmental data from Thomson Reuters ESG database. We obtain financial and accounting data from DataStream and WorldScope, and we take country-level data from the climate change laws of the world and the world governance indicators. The dependent variable in this exercise is return on assets, and we also perform some robustness checks with a bit and Tobin scale. Independent variable is environmental normative deviance, this distance with the leader in environmental performance. The moderating variables, as I said, complexity, dynamism, and hostility, and control variables from industry and country level covariates. These are the results, and we build 5 different models. We introduce sequential interactions in model 2, 3, and 4, and we finally have a complete model in the last one. First, we should be focusing on the coefficient of normative deviance. This is in line with conventional wisdom. The more the firm deviates from the leader, the higher the penalties or the lower the performance that results from that behavior. And then, at the bottom of the table, we have the moderations. We can focus on model 5, but as you can see, the coefficients and the significativity does not change. What we see is that our hypotheses are supported. The more the complexity, even lower is the normative deviance. The higher the dynamism, even lower is the normative deviance, the consequences of normative deviance, and the same for hostility. This is what this negative coefficient conveys. To make sense of this, we can take a look at this figure. It's basically plotting the firm performance according to different levels of normative deviance and according to different levels of complexity. Here, to the right, we see how when normative deviance is high, the lower performance is achieved when complexity is very high. That means this points to +2 standard deviations. Nevertheless, when complexity is very low, -2 standard deviations, the consequences of normative deviance are not significantly different from other levels. So this makes the consequences of not fulfilling with social norms contingent on the conditions of the environment. So, as I just said, the determinants evaluations are not consistent. They depend, their stringency depend on the conditions of the environment. I will focus more on what organizations, some organizations, well, generally all organizations are doing relative to others when difficulties to obtain information increase. Then we also show that normative deviance can be a valid institutional response. Organizations can have different responses. They can, of course, they can follow social norms. They can attack social norms and try to change them. And this work shows that they can also ignore social pressures under particular circumstances. And as a contribution for the climate change literature, these results should convey the information that environmental social pressures work, but not always. It depends on the conditions of the environment. And finally, we move to the institutional factor, this third influence on organizations' environmental behavior. And one caveat before beginning, in the last chapter, I was talking about environmental normative deviance. There is a difference between the leaders and other organization performance in environmental behavior, but without assuming that this would result in any misbehavior, penalized by law. Here in this paper, we focus specifically on controversial behavior. That means the scandals, legal infringements, labor exploitation, things that have legal consequences, okay? So misconduct, misbehavior. The logic is the same. We should see that organizations, because we have institutions, because we have social pressures, organizations shouldn't engage in this kind of behavior, but they do. And two different explanations have been put forward to explain this. First one individual organizational factors. And second one, the relationship of organization with the social control agents. For instance, if I'm a very important firm, I can go against the norms and no one will punish me. In this study, and within anthropology, economics, and psychology, we propose a complementary explanation, that is culture. And more specifically, we'll be looking at how organizational misbehavior in terms of environmental actions differs across countries depending on the origins of the agrarian system of the country, the historical origins. So, a bit of history before delving into it. We'll be comparing wheat-based societies with rice-based societies. And by this, I will later tell you how I measure this. Wheat cultivation started in the Fertile Crescent, around 8500 BCE. From there, it spread in two different directions, one to Europe, reaching the British Island around 6500 BCE, and then it moved to the east, to South Asia. So these are the two different lines of spread of wheat. On the opposite, we have the cultivation of rice. The cultivation of rice started in the Yangtze River in China. From there, it spread to India, Southeast Asia, and ending in Japan and Korea through population flows. These, as you can imagine, these divides more or less strongly the world into wheat-based societies that weren't exposed to rice until around the 16th century because of a combination of crops in the world stemming from the Columbian Exchange. And on the other hand, we have rice-based societies that weren't so exposed to wheat. And to understand why these societies differ, we need to understand a little bit about how the rice cultivation worked. Rice cultivation posed a problem of economic problem of collective action, a coordination problem. First, it required the construction of irrigation networks. And irrigation networks were so costly that no family alone could engage in this construction. So the whole village had to contribute to this, and this created a coordination problem. The second one was labor exchange. Rice was so costly to harvest and to plant and to grow that, again, the whole village would be involved in the task. So, because of the prevailing opportunism in this kind of collective action, strong mechanisms of control developed, and this mechanism was implicit. That is, individuals would start to focus on what others do as a way to punishing them if they misbehaved. So, if you behaved opportunistically, I will be looking at you systematically, and I will punish you if I see some weird behavior. Based on this, a cultural evolutionary process started. Why? Because collective activity, gains of this collective economic activity increased when there was no opportunism. So this advantage favored the development of some cultural traits in these societies. To be sure, a cultural selection, cultural evolution works in the way that traits are selected depending on the payoffs they provide to the group. And we know that less opportunism equals or has results in more gains to economic activity. Translated to organizational controversies will be lower in countries whose historical roots are tied to rice production. Normative deviance data, this behavior is Thomson Reuters ESG database. Rice cultivation data comes from the history database of the global environment. Financial and accounting data from data stream and also about country level data. Again, the dependent variable will be the ESG controversies score from Thomson Reuters. The independent variable will be the historical production of rice in 2000 BC. At the country level is measured this. And then an array of control variables. Here we have the first 4 models. It's a OLS regression. And we see that one standard deviation in the historical cultivation of rice reduces 1.8 standard deviations the organization's controversies. To the left, the following 5 models, we have a quantitative regression to explore how this effect varies across the distribution of our dependent variable. And we see that this effect, one could expect, increases as we move right to the distribution. The main insights, well, social control can vary widely across societies, trading heterogeneity into which organizations are pushed to comply with norms. So there is a cultural factors that regulate how much organizations comply with social norms. Then we explain a little bit where the need to conform with social expectations comes from opportunism and bounded rationality, matched with historical factors. So this can be thought of, we have humans have a cognitive biases that then we applied it to in our daily lives, and this results in a development path of a country. And finally, this study, I think, reveals the need to go beyond institutional black boxes to explain organizational behavior, right? For instance, we usually think of collectivism as a cultural trait that pushes individuals or make individuals put their collective objectives in front of individual objectives. But some research is recently showing that collectivism is more about vigilance and considering what others are doing. And finally, some summary and conclusions. So the grand challenge, as I said at the beginning, the grand challenge of climate change forces us to engage in unprecedented efforts. And we need to make, from the organizational standpoint of view, we need to make this need to compatible with business profits, with business logics. Then we see that organizational environmental behavior is determined by 3 different factors: organizational factors, industry factors, and institutional factors. And this means that managerial discretion is important to fight climate change. The complexity, dynamism, and hostility of environment conditions the success of environmental social pressures, that this should be important to consider by policymakers. And then we know also that environmental behavior of organizations has a deep root in the history of the country. And that's all from my side.
Questions, remarks?
I have a question regarding the last chapter, because it was, I didn't expect that kind of analysis. It is completely different from the other chapters. I have just a curiosity, because it may be the case, I don't know, maybe the case that higher level of controversies regarding ESG and this kind of things may be related to the fact that the respect to the law, or how strong are the law and the development of justice and all that kind of things could could introduce some impact on the results, because, for instance, it could be the case that there is more respect for the law, and as a consequence, people are more in a position to raise controversies with firms in countries like I don't know, Europe or USA, and that is not the case in countries in Asian countries, for instance. So, have you considered this thing? Have you think about that, or introduce some kind of controls for that?
Of additional estimations looking at these possible confounding effects. I mean, from 2000 BC to today, they can happen a lot of things, right? So we try to control for all those things.
Are there any person online that would like to ask any question or comments? Okay. Well, thank you again for this presentation. I think that this is a very innovative work. In fact, as Miguel has mentioned already, could be many questions around the results, and there is, as you mentioned, black boxes, and there are other, not social media, but the big media box that helps the controversy and facilitates the undesirable behaviors of countries and governments. But I think that this research is very innovative. And well, can you tell us if you have already published some part of this work?
Yeah, the chapter 1. We have published chapter 1.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
we'll try.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Okay.